Carol arrived on a Tuesday. Norma brought her at 10 in the morning, which was earlier than Norma normally arrives, which told me that Norma had been planning this with more intention than she had let on when she described it as simply bringing a friend. Carol was 68 years old. She had silver hair, good posture. Norma had been accurate about the posture and the particular composure of a woman who has been through something significant and has arrived after considerable work at a functional relationship with it. She was carrying a small potted plant. I looked at the plant. Norma said, "It's not a fern." I told her about the fern situation. She brought something more appropriate. I asked what the fern situation was. Norma said, "I told her you kill plants." She brought a cactus. Cacti are very resilient. Carol said, "I'm so sorry." She told me you were a very capable man. She didn't mention the plants. I told her the plant situation was more complicated than Norma had represented. Norma said, "The situation is that you killed my plant within 2 weeks. The situation is very simple." I told Norma the plant had arrived already dying. Norma said, "It was fine when I brought it." Carol looked between us with an expression I would come to recognize as her standard response to Norma. A kind of fond, experienced calm. The look of a woman who has known Norma long enough to understand that the most productive response to most of what Norma says is to simply wait for it to finish. She set the cactus on the counter next to the fake succulent. We had coffee. And it was fine. Carol was easy company, quiet in the way of people who listen before they speak, which is a quality I have always respected and rarely encountered. She asked me about the garden. We talked for perhaps 40 minutes about things that were light and unremarkable and pleasant. And then Norma said she needed to make a phone call and disappeared into the other room, which was the most transparent exit I have ever witnessed from a woman who is otherwise incapable of subtlety. Carol looked at the door Norma had gone through. Then she looked at me. She said, "She means well." I told her I knew. She said, "She told me you lost your wife 3 years ago. She said she was remarkable." I told her that was accurate. She said, "My husband died 14 months ago. 14 months and 3 days. She said it simply, the way people say things when they have said them enough times that the sentence no longer requires careful handling, but hasn't yet lost its weight. I told her I was sorry. She nodded. She said, "Everyone keeps telling me it gets easier, and then they tell me I need to move on. And I keep smiling and thanking them because I know they mean well. And I don't have the energy to explain why both of those things, while I'm sure they're true for some people, feel completely wrong to me." She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "Does it actually get easier? You've had 3 years. Does it?" I sat with that question for a moment before I answered it, because it deserved a real answer. Not a comfort and not a deflection. The real thing. The answer I would give a patient who had asked me something important and was waiting for the truth rather than the management of their feelings. I said, "It gets different. Different is not the same as easier, but different, in my experience, is eventually better than what the beginning was." She looked at me. She said, "That's the first honest answer anyone has given me." And something about that sentence, the specific relief in it, the exhale quality of it, the way she said it like a person who has been holding their breath and has finally been given permission to breathe, unlocked something in me that I had been carrying for several months without fully examining. The conversation about moving on. The thing everyone says. The thing that had been said to me in various forms by various well-meaning people in the years since Margaret died. The instruction that I had received with gratitude and set aside, without being able to fully explain why it sat wrong. I knew why, now, looking at Carol's face across my kitchen table, 14 months and 3 days into her loss, being told by a retired physician that the honest answer was that it gets different rather than easier. I knew exactly why move on had always felt wrong, and I wanted to tell her the problem with moving on, what it actually means and why it fails. I want to talk about this directly, because I think it is one of the most common and most damaging pieces of advice that grieving people receive. And I have been on the receiving end of it long enough now to understand exactly where it goes wrong. Moving on implies leaving. It implies that the correct response to the loss of someone you loved is to put sufficient distance between yourself and the loss, to travel far enough away from it, in time and in emotional geography, that it is behind you rather than with you. That healing is a matter of direction and speed. That if you are still feeling the loss with any regularity, still reaching for the second cup by accident, still pausing at the Tuesday program, still having mornings where the garden looks like the garden, and also like the absence of the person who used to sit on the porch and watch you in it. If you are still doing any of those things, you have not yet moved far enough. You need to move on. I spent 40 years in emergency medicine. I watched hundreds of people lose the people they loved most. I watched them in the first hours and the first days, and when they returned to check in, or when I crossed paths with them later, in the months and years that followed. And I can tell you, with the specific certainty of someone who has observed this pattern across a very long time and a very large number of people, that moving on is not what the healthy ones did. What they did was something different, something that looks similar from the outside but is structurally entirely different. They moved forward. Forward does not mean away. Forward means continuing to be alive, continuing to engage with the present, to invest in the relationships still available, to find meaning in the ordinary days, while carrying the person you lost with you, rather than leaving them behind as the price of your own continued functioning. The people I watched who tried to move on, who accepted the instruction, who forced the distance, who treated grief as a project to be completed rather than a weight to be integrated, those people did not heal faster. They delayed. They compacted the grief into something smaller and denser and more difficult to eventually process, and they arrived at it later, often in forms that were harder to recognize as grief because they no longer looked like sadness. They looked like numbness or irritability or a low-grade disengagement from their own lives that they couldn't quite explain. They had moved on. They had left the grief behind, and the grief had waited. Because grief does not accept abandonment. It is not a place you can leave and lock the door behind you. It is a person you loved, transformed into the shape of their absence, and it lives in your life now. In the second cup, and the Tuesday program, and the garden, and the back porch. And the question is not whether you can move away from it, but whether you can learn to live with it present. What I told Carol, and what she said back. I told her some of this at the kitchen table. Not all of it. The full version takes longer than a Tuesday morning with Norma in the next room pretending to make a phone call. But the essential part. I told her that moving on was the wrong instruction. That the people who told her that were not wrong to care about her. They were wrong about the mechanism. That what they were trying to tell her, underneath the phrase, was that she was allowed to continue living. That her husband's death did not require her to stop. That the love she had for him did not need to be managed into something smaller and more contained in order for her to be functional. She could carry it at full size. She could be fully in grief and fully alive at the same time. They are not competing conditions. They are, in my experience, more often companion conditions. The grief and the aliveness running parallel. The loss making the living more present and more specific and more urgent, the continuing life giving the lost something to exist alongside rather than something to extinguish. Carol was quiet for a moment after I said this. Then she said, "My daughter told me I needed to stop talking about Richard so much, that it wasn't healthy, that I was keeping myself stuck." She said it without anger, with the specific, careful neutrality of a person who has decided not to feel what they could feel about something because the person who said it loves them. I asked her what she said back. She said, "I told her she was probably right, and then I went home and I talked to Richard's photograph for 20 minutes. She looked at me. She said, 'Is that terrible?' I told her it was not terrible. That I had, in the months after Margaret died, conducted several conversations with the garden on the assumption that she could see it from wherever she was. That I had read certain passages from books out loud, because she had loved those books, and the reading out loud felt like including her. She said, 'And you're a physician.' I told her medicine had not immunized me from being human. If anything, it had given me a very specific education in what being human actually looks like, which is messier and less rational and considerably more love-driven than most of the frameworks we build around it." She said, "I feel like I've been doing grief wrong." I told her there was no wrong way to do grief. There was only the way that moved through you and the way that got stuck. And the way that got stuck was usually the one that involved trying to manage the grief according to someone else's timeline. She nodded slowly. She said, "Richard would have liked you." I told her I appreciated that. She said, "He was a precise man too. He would have asked you 100 questions about the ER. He was a retired engineer. He wanted to understand how everything worked." I told her that was a quality I respected. She said, "He drove me insane with it for 46 years. She said it with the exact warmth of someone describing something they would give anything to have back. The patient I kept thinking about while Carol was talking. I want to tell you about someone I treated. Her name, I'll call her Ruth, was 73 years old when she came into my department. She had lost her husband of 48 years 4 months earlier, suddenly, and had been doing what her family described as very well. Functioning. Active. Not visibly struggling. She had joined a grief group at her church. She was seeing her grandchildren regularly. She was, by every external measure, moving on. She came in for chest pain. The chest pain was not cardiac. After a thorough evaluation, what we found was more consistent with what I can only describe, in clinical terms, as a body under the prolonged stress of compressed grief. Ruth had been so committed to functioning, to moving on, to not being a burden to her children with the size of her loss, that she had been managing her grief rather than experiencing it for 4 months. And the body, which is less amenable to management than the mind, had eventually registered its objection. I spent some time with Ruth. I asked her, gently, how she was actually doing. Not the functional version, the actual version. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I wake up every morning and I think about Thomas before I open my eyes. And then I open my eyes and I remember, and the whole day has that particular flavor of a day that is missing something it should have. I've had that flavor every morning for 4 months." She paused. She said, "But I don't say that to anyone, because everyone is so relieved that I'm doing well. I don't want to take that away from them." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about how much of grief is managed for the comfort of the people who are not in it. How the grieving person becomes, at some point in the process, responsible for making the people around them feel better about the grief, for presenting a version of the loss that is digestible, that is trending in the right direction, that allows the people who love them to feel that the situation is resolving. Ruth was doing well. She was doing well with such consistency and such commitment that she had suppressed what she was actually experiencing, to the point where her body had started sending messages her mind had refused to receive. I told her what I had been learning to tell myself in the years since Margaret died. I told her that grief is not a problem to be solved or a project to be completed. It is a relationship, the relationship with the person you lost, transformed by their absence into a different shape, but no less real. And like all relationships, it requires attention. It requires that you actually show up for it rather than manage it from a distance. I told her it was acceptable to wake up every morning and think about Thomas before she opened her eyes. That was not being stuck. That was loving someone. And the love did not have an expiration date, she cried. Not dramatically. The quiet, private kind. The kind that has been waiting behind the performance of doing well for 4 months. I gave her the name of a grief counselor I trusted, and I told her to be as honest with that person as she had just been with me. She came back to the department about a year later for something unrelated, and she told me she had taken my advice, that she was seeing the counselor, that she was, in her words, actually grieving now instead of managing it. She said, "It's harder, but it feels more real. And real, I have decided, is better than managed. Real is better than managed." I have thought about that sentence many times since Ruth said it, because it captures something about the difference between moving on and moving forward that I had been trying to articulate and had not quite found the words for. Moving on is managed. It is the performance of grief having been resolved, executed with varying degrees of success, for the comfort of the people watching. Moving forward is real. It is the actual experience of continuing to be alive while carrying something heavy, not pretending the weight isn't there, not performing its absence, but integrating it into the life in a way that allows the life to continue at full capacity. Real is better than managed. Ruth was right. What 3 years have actually taught me. I want to be honest about where I am, because I think honesty is what makes anything I say worth hearing. 3 years after Margaret died, I am not healed in the way the word healing is usually applied to loss. I do not expect to be. Healing, in that usage, implies a return to a previous state, the restoration of what existed before the injury. That is not what happens with the loss of someone central to your life. The previous state no longer exists. You cannot return to it. What I am 3 years out is integrated. The loss is part of the structure now. It is not separate from my life, something I carry in addition to my life. It is woven through it, present in the daily fabric, in a way that is no longer primarily painful, and is sometimes, in ways I did not anticipate and could not have predicted in those first weeks, something else. It is present as appreciation, the specific, acute awareness of what I have had, of the 41 years, the coffee, the Tuesday program, the July porch, the handwriting on the envelope. That awareness is sharper now than it was when the things it refers to were still present. The grief clarified them. The absence illuminated the value in a way that the presence, taken as background, did not always permit. I appreciate the garden more now than I did when Margaret was alive to sit on the porch and watch me in it. I appreciate the ordinary Tuesday more. I appreciate Norma. Impossible, loud, incorrect plant-bringing Norma. More than I can adequately express, because I understand now, in a way I did not fully understand before, what it costs a person to show up consistently, and what it gives the person they are showing up for. I appreciate the ordinary days, not despite Margaret's absence. Because of it. Because the absence taught me, in the most direct and unavoidable way available, that the ordinary days were always the extraordinary ones, that the fabric of a shared life is made of Tuesday mornings and second cups, and programs watched on the couch, and gardens tended while someone watches from a porch, and that the correct response to understanding that is not grief alone, but attention, active, chosen, renewed every morning attention to the life that is currently available. That is where 3 years has brought me. Not moved on, moved forward, with Margaret carried, not left. Back to Carol and what she said before she left. Carol and I talked at the kitchen table for about an hour and a half. Norma appeared twice, once to refresh the coffee, once to offer an opinion on something we had not asked for her opinion on, which was then immediately retracted when she registered the quality of the conversation. Both appearances were brief. Both times she took one look at the room and understood that what was happening did not require her contribution. She is learning, slowly, but she is learning. When Carol got up to leave, she paused at the back door, the same door Norma always pauses at, the door that seems to function in my kitchen as the place where the real things get said on the way out. She said, "Thank you. I came today because Norma insisted, and I didn't really want to come. I hadn't talked to anyone honestly about Richard in several weeks. I've been managing." I told her I understood that. She said, "I think I'm going to stop managing and start actually doing it, whatever that looks like." I told her that was the right decision. She picked up the cactus from the counter. I had assumed she was leaving it, and she held it out to me. She said, "Keep it. I have 6 more at home." Richard bought them because he read they were impossible to kill. He bought 6 of them as a challenge. She smiled. He was right. They're thriving. I can't get rid of them. I took the cactus. I set it on the windowsill next to the fake succulent. She said, "Will you be here next Tuesday?" I told her I was usually here on Tuesdays. She said, "Then maybe I'll come back, if that's all right." I told her it was all right. She left. Norma came back from wherever she had been and stood in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a person waiting to be told how something went. I looked at her. She said, "Well?" I told her Carol was good company. Norma said, "I know she is. I've known her for 12 years. She's one of the best people I know." A pause. "She's also been very sad for 14 months. And sad people need other sad people sometimes. People who don't need the sadness to be smaller than it is." She said it plainly, without performance. Norma's version of something profound, stated quickly, without ceremony, on the way to asking if I needed anything else from the store. I told her I didn't need anything from the store. She said, "You need coffee filters. You always need coffee filters." She left. I stood in the kitchen with the new cactus and the fake succulent, and the knowledge that next Tuesday there would be 3 people at the table instead of 2. What I want you to take from this. I want to give you 2 things before you go. The first is permission. If you are carrying a loss, any stage, I want to give you permission to stop moving on and start moving forward. They are different directions. Moving on leaves the person behind. Moving forward brings them with you, and you are allowed to bring them. The love does not have a defined expiration date, after which it becomes pathological. It becomes part of who you are. You are allowed to talk to the photograph, to read the book out loud, to make the second cup by accident on a Tuesday morning and sit with it for a while before you get up, to wake up every morning and think about them before you open your eyes, to have days where the ordinary hours have that particular flavor of something missing that Ruth described. Not every day, hopefully, as the years pass, but some days. And on those days, you are not failing to heal. You are continuing to love someone who is gone. That is not the same thing. The second thing is about the people in your life who are carrying something. Stop telling them to move on. I understand the impulse. It comes from love, from the desire to see someone you care about relieved of their suffering. But move on tells a grieving person that the size of what they are carrying is a problem to be solved rather than a love to be honored. It tells them, however unintentionally, that the person they lost should be left behind as the cost of their own recovery. Say instead, I see what you're carrying. You don't have to pretend it's smaller than it is. You're allowed to bring them with you, and then do what Norma does, which is show up on Tuesday and not require the grief to be any particular size or shape or stage of resolution. Just show up and let the person carry what they carry at the size it actually is, without performing their recovery for your comfort. That is the most useful thing you can offer someone in grief. More useful than the instruction to move on. More useful than the assurance that it gets easier. More useful sometimes than anything except the simple, renewable Tuesday by Tuesday act of being present. In the comments, I want to hear from you. Has someone told you to move on when what you needed was something different? Or have you said it to someone else and understood, reading this, why it landed wrong? Tell me. And next week, Carol is coming back to Tuesday. I don't know yet what comes after that, but I'll tell you when I do. My name is Dr. Edward Carver. I'll see you then.